Hello and welcome to week 2 in developmental psychology. Now hopefully you've got your head wrapped around what we mean by developmental perspective, and that we are really looking at the timing of particular things, events in our lives, and normative development versus incidents from the outside or changes in our physical condition that can lead to aberrations in our what would be considered normal line of development. Now, as we enter into that timeline of our life, we're right at the beginning, so we're looking at the factors involved in developmental psych that occur very early in life, and that is prenatal, childbirth, and infancy. So looking at those very, very early times, of course, very critical times, and we'll talk about the word critical and its applications to critical periods in which in utero, and how that applies across the lifespan, but particularly in utero, how there's things that are developing. It's probably the most concrete way to kind of look at the developmental perspective when we say, well, how many weeks along are you? And you can look at this chart that we're going to examine and say, well, this is the stuff that's going on right now. This is the stuff that's happening. So by knowing the age, we can say, well, here's the particular developmental things that are happening at that specific age in utero. And we have models and whatnot to exemplify that kind of thinking after we're born throughout our lifespan. So let's take a first look at back into Brightspace and getting again a little bit familiar with the interface here. We've been in here for a week, so hopefully you're watching the videos here. So you come into the class and you're looking at the announcements to see what's going on, and then you click on content. And content brings you to, I've already gone to chapter 2 here, but it's going to bring you back wherever you left off. So just be aware of that. You might come in and go like, oh, how come I'm in chapter 1 or something like that? Oh, that's where you were the last time you left the class. So back into the class, you can click up here for the overview and syllabus. This kind of looks like what it looked like when you first came in. Just as a review here in course documents, make sure that you have gone down here to the textbook and coursebook information, and that you have successfully downloaded our textbook and one of these versions of the coursebook. Now, in that regard, I would like to, for one, if you press on the PDF version of the coursebook, it will most likely load into your browser, and you kind of what you want to do is like right-click that and download the actual file so you can read it offline. You don't always have to be, on the KVCC Brightspace to read that. You can download it. The EPUB version is really made for tablets. Coming to that conclusion after using it for a couple semesters, if you have an iPad or if you have a book reader of some kind, or an Android or something, it is ideal for that platform because you could just read it like a regular book. And the videos play live within the document instead of just linking to YouTube. That's the only difference between those two. So the PDF is much smaller. Keep that on. You can also read that in your tablet. It doesn't really matter. Download that onto your device, and that's where, of course, the content of the class is. So we're in there and we go back to content, and then we learn in the course timeline that here in week 2, we have chapter 2. There are 2 discussions and a quiz. But I want you to take note that next week there's a cultural dimensions of childbirth assignment. This is our first special assignment. And I'm going to be doing a special video on that, explaining that, along with the instructions that are in the course book in that first chapter, the first assignment, Cultural Dimensions of Childbirth. And then I'll post that video in the course next to the Dropbox for that particular assignment. So that'll be in the Special Assignments folder right here. Okay, so you'll go there, Cultural Dimensions of Childbirth, and there's going to be a video here. a little bit later. I'm going to work on that. Okay, so let's go into the course book now and take a look at this chapter 2. And what I'm going to do is sort of quickly review the content of the course book. This is, again, this is very review. And I guess I meant to say just a second ago that as you're approaching this class, I've often told people, read the textbook, read the course book, and then do everything. I'm going to ask you to do something else. I'm going to ask you to read the course book. You have to do that because you won't understand what I'm asking you to do in the assignments. So read the course book, do the assignments, and then go to the textbook and read the corresponding chapter. I put that third because what it does, it rounds off your education. It allows you to focus on the things that are going to be graded first, and there's lots of content included in the course book, and then round it off with that chapter reading at the end. And really make an effort to digest the textbook as well as the course book because there's a lot more detail in there. What you get out of the course book is really a selection of, a few of my favorite developmental things. And so what I want you to do is you're getting that as from me as a teacher in this class, but I want you to be able to have a much more expanded knowledge of what we know about human development by also reading that textbook. So that's my suggestion for how you might approach this class. So let's go back into the course book here, heredity, prenatal development, and birth. And we start off right off by examining the issue of, or the concept of eugenics, which has a long history in psychology. It's a darker history for sure. And eugenics is the philosophy that just as we understand evolution, and was really put forth by Francis Galton, was a famous proponent of eugenics. And Francis Galton was, I'm having a brain freeze. Charles Darwin's cousin. They knew each other, they're friends, they're cousins, they're related to each other. So Darwinism, and looking at how traits are passed on and that the environment impacts and environment selects particular traits for survival, in a way, the natural thought of that, well, can we apply that, progressively in selective breeding of human beings? Now, automatically, I hope all your flags are going up and going, whoa, wait a minute. We can breed dogs, and look what we did to them. And that notion that we should apply the concepts of Darwinism and selective breeding to human beings is the idea of eugenics. And maybe at one level, maybe we can breed out susceptibility to diseases, but then at the same time, those individuals were talking about breeding out persons of color, or breeding out persons with mental retardation, or person with certain disabilities, of which those individuals, of course, enrich our world. And so there's that, how far do we go with the science that we have? And of course, eugenics has had a very, very negative consequences. Francis Galton's books held a very special place in Adolf Hitler's personal library. So we can see that the applications to that are quite poor. And but a little bit on that, because we're kind of talking about that particular area. And we see here that there was some custom babies that were made, these Chinese scientists using CRISPR, which is a genetic engineering tool. And you can watch that video. There's a link to that video. I'm not quite sure if it's still there or not, because that guy is in jail. He's in jail. He got arrested by the Chinese government. We don't know the whole story, but this was not a good thing. And scientists are on the fence about pure science research and applications, and when do we do that? This has been the quandary of science ever since, the Manhattan Project, when we thought, do we want to build the bomb because there's going to be forever consequences because of that. And, scientists trying to be thoughtful of that. So there's some active history that's going on. So I will point out here, though, in my version of the course book, you'll see that this video right here is not there. Now, if you're using the EPUB version and it's gone onto your iPad or your tablet, you're going to see this, and what you want to do is simply tap to view. It's asking me, do I want to load the content from the internet? I allow it, and there's the video. Now, it looks like the same video as this one, but I do believe that this one has the stuff at the end about the prison sentence. Now, once you load the content into one of those movies in the EPUB version, it takes the whole book. It does the whole book. So as you're going along, it might take a little while for pages to load because it's sometimes loading that content from the web. So there you go. So that's our introduction. We go into what are we going to be looking at, introducing you to things like teratogens, and looking at patterns of development that we see very early on, cephalocaudal and proximodistal development. Discuss the sources of personality traits as being genetic, phenotype, genotype, and then environmental, kind of really looking at that nature versus nurture, where it's really not nature versus nurture, it's nature and nurture ultimately for almost everything. And then discuss basically the pros and cons of home childbirth and other alternative methods of birthing. So we go in, and I'm going to go through this rather quickly. I don't have to read this for you. So we have our nature versus nurture question that has always been within the field of psychology. To what degree do we attribute who we are right now as a function of our genetics or as a function of our experiences? So nature, genetics, or nurture, experiences and events in our lives. Now, most oftentimes we look at it's always a combination, but even in the world of behavioral genetics, which is looking at, very precisely at that, they often form statistics. What percentage of this particular trait can we attribute to genetics through the genetic studies that we do, and then the rest of it we would assume would be attributable to environmental differences. So a classic one is intelligence. Now we know a good computer and good software is probably going to lead to higher intelligence. So to a degree, intelligence is determined by the quality of someone's brain, the quality of their neurological production, the complexity of the support neurons, the glial cells with their brains and whatnot. All of these things attribute to a person's intelligence. But if that person happened to be born in an environment that was not literate, was native, they would have certainly very high cultural intelligence. They'd be able to apply that within that context, but that would not be generalized to Western conceptions of IQ and whatnot, because that's dependent on experience. The actual formula is 50-50. It's one of the more famous ones. Is about 50% of our intelligence is because we were born with it, good or bad, and the other 50% of our intelligence is our experiences. So you can see someone might be born without a real propensity for intelligence, but works really hard to bring their intelligence high. You might have another individual born with natural talent, but drugs themselves, engages in a lifestyle where it's never applied and they never go anywhere. And you would have the actual phenotype, the actual expression of the person's intelligence, the individual with less genetic capacity would actually have a higher IQ than the person with higher genetic capacity. So we see these kinds of things in the studies of that idea of nature versus nurture. So in the course book, I go a little bit into some basic genetics, what is phenotype and genotype. Here's a movie about chromosomes and stuff like that. And then what happens when there are chromosomal disorders like Turner syndrome, Down syndrome. And again, these were often the target not only of eugenics, but of the Nazi regime of looking undesirable individuals, people who were had Turner syndrome and Down syndrome, particular racial categories, and homosexuals. Now, it's interesting, for example, just a little clue on that. They felt that that was genetic, and it wasn't until way years later that we actually, kind of made that part of our modern society. So at least they had that right, but certainly their response wasn't appropriate. So these individuals were seen as genetically inferior and therefore damaging the human gene pool, ultimately in their minds leading to the destruction of humanity, or at least holding back the evolution of humanity. So they had to be eliminated. Just a wacky way of thinking. So, but some of these are disorders that we know exist within not homosexuality, but the Down syndrome and Klinefelter syndrome and Turner syndrome, and these things that are genetic abnormalities that result in particular kinds of manifestations in small children. So we go through some of those. You can see how it's loading a little slowly because it's loading these videos all the time. This is what a genetic counselor does. We get into behavioral genetics here, where we see, and this is interesting because let's say when we look at something like temperament, which is going to be a little bit later, that's an aspect of our personality. It's only a component, early manifestations of our personality coming primarily from genetic sources, but those expressions of personality, let's say you're very outgoing and very active, exist within a milieu, a social milieu, and those interact. And the interaction between the social milieu, or the environment, the family that a person is in, and the expression of their genetic aspects of their personality. If you have a really, really outgoing, rambunctious child living in a very outgoing, rambunctious family, wow, that works. There's a really good mesh of that, and here's my kid, and, all of that. But what if it's the opposite? What if it's a very timid, not very active child, but very, very active parents, and like, oh, something's wrong with my kid or something. But they have to overcome that difference of the natural expressions of their children and the environment in which they're built. And sometimes there can be a mismatch. There can be where the individual's sense of connection and bonding with attachment to that individual might be compromised by the fact that there's a mismatch between the early genetic expressions of the personality and the existing genetic and environmental manifestations of the adult personalities in their immediate social milieu. So that's where we see, it's called goodness of fit, is when we refer to that as the natural tendencies of the child and then expectations and personality, the caregiver in line with one another, and what do we do when they're not in line. It's not that they're guaranteed not successful, but it is a very important part of early childhood development. So in here, we kind of look at that specifically when we look at the genotype environment correlations, the genetic expressions and their relationship in environments. And we define different ones like passive genotype environment correlations, where the children passively inherit genes and the environment of their parents. Let's say that athletic ability, let's see what I write about this, and the opportunity for athletics occurs in an athletic family. This is aligned. Then evocative genotype environment correlations. Social environments react to individuals based upon their inherited characteristics. The temperament of a child or the presence of a disorder will cause the environment to change. So this is part of that adaptive process where a particular genetic manifestation comes out and the environment needs to adapt to it. A child is born into a family and the child has Down syndrome. It changes the environment, not just the child. The environment needs to change. It needs to adapt in order to accommodate for the specific needs of a child with Down syndrome. And then finally, active genotype environments, correlations. Individuals seek out environments that support their genetic tendencies. We see this happening, of course, early, but also later in life. We'll see this manifest in how, when we start talking about how we choose friends and how we even choose careers, is we have genetic propensities to move in a particular direction, and we'll be attracted to that because when we're in those environments, there's an alignment, there's a goodness of fit between our personality experience and those around us in those environments that we select to put ourselves into. So that becomes that. And you see how this is lifespan. You see how active genotype environmental correlations are things that we create, we actively create. We pick friends, we pick careers, we pick associations, we pick all kinds of things, environments that we want to live in because they align with who we are. And to a degree that's genetic. To the degree that that's genetic, in terms of propensities that we have toward particular likes, dislikes, and that it's part of this active genotype correlation process. So let's look now into prenatal development and this period of time when the child is still inside of mom. There's an iOS app that I put in there. This is kind of basics biology here, just going through the stages. And we get right in here, this area, and we look at cephalocaudal proximal distant development. And what we see on a physiological basis is that cephalocaudal means cephalo means the head, caudal means tail. So we get development happening at the head and then migrating, the development happens to the tail. So the head becomes the most developed piece, and then the tail trails behind and eventually catches up. The same happens from the midline moving out, and that's a proximal, meaning close to the midline and out. So we'll see in things like motor development, we'll see the child's going to develop trunk ability before upper arm ability, and then they'll develop lower arm ability, and then hand ability, and then finally finger ability. And we're looking at that proximal moving out to distal neurological development in that case. They can roll over and get up on a push-up way before they can pick up a Cheerio. So that's the proximal distal type of development. So we see that exemplified in the course book in this video here that shows different stages of prenatal development. Another video, and then here some factors of neurogenesis going into these three: neuron proliferation, neuron differentiation, and neuron migration, which is, to me, some of the most fascinating aspects of human development. Is that the proliferation, meaning how fast we are producing neurons in utero. Neuron differentiation, as these neurons are developing, they develop into various kinds of neurons, from motor neurons to sensory neurons to movement neurons to all the interrelated neurons that actually translate information. There's actually 3 layers of different kinds of neurons in the retina, not just light sensitive ones. There are neurons that collect information from surrounding neurons and make a general sort of neurological signal. There's others that suppress the activity, other neurons that job is to suppress the activity of surrounding neurons so that we can see edges more clearly than they really are. So how cool is that, right? So there's all kinds of that differentiation of nerves that then eventually results in a total human being. Just fascinating. And of course, neuron migration, because we're looking from a cephalocaudal proximal distal development, the neurons actually move, climbing physically along glial fibers, reacting to neurochemical environmental factors to find their place in the human body, stay there, and then become just like life, right? We're following a lifeline early and on. We're going along our tracks, climbing our rope, our ladder, however we want it, whatever analogy we want to use, until we find our place, and then we settle in, and there we are. Very much the way the neuron acts, and it moves around the body. So this video in the course book exemplifies some of those things. Very cool stuff. Here's a nice big picture of brain development here, and you'll see. I mean, you can already see this top part here. This is all undifferentiated here, and it becomes more and more differentiated as this part kind of lags behind for the cephalocaudal type of development. Very cool. But this is actually have to do with how complex the brain gets in just a matter of weeks. And here's an important. This is the chart that I was talking about a little bit earlier that really exemplifies the developmental perspective, and that is when we ask psychological questions, as I'm going to ask in one of the quizzes in this week's material, in this chapter, is what's based on what we know about normative human development. If we know a person's age, we can ask, well, what's going on? What's going on at age 9? What's going on at age 10? Those of you who have had children, you have that experience. We have our own experience. What was going on at age 9, 10? And in the long-term development, we're going to be talking about social theories, learning theories, cognitive development, the social clock, psychological clock, historical clock, biological clock, all of those different clocks. And we look at all of those. There's a lot going on all the time. What we're looking at right now as a kind of microcosm of example of that specific concept of the developmental perspectives. We're looking in utero, because that timeline has been deeply studied. So the chart, this chart right here, what it shows you is in the weeks leading from conception to birth, the actual development of organs and functions within the human fetus, or, well, it starts as an embryo and then turns into a fetus. So you can draw a line. Let's say we were looking at week 4, and we're going to define week 4 right where the number is, right where this right here is, that number. Now, if you drew a line going right through number 4, that line would intersect with neural development, heart development, upper limbs, lower limbs, ear, not quite at the eye, not the palate, not the teeth, external genitalia. So we know that neuron development, heart development, upper limbs, lower limbs, and ear. Now, the purpose of this is to understand what development is happening right around week 4. I mean, this is not exact. I mean, there's diversity and stuff, but this kind of gives us an idea. And so as we move into a discussion next about what we term teratogens, which are chemicals, environmental, sociological, biochemical, anything that can impact the development of a child in utero, if the child is exposed to that, we say, well, what's the potential outcomes? And we would say, well, how old is the child? Remember, developmental perspective. How old is the child in terms of their in utero development? We'll say, well, 4 weeks gestation. Let's go to the chart. Let's look at 4 weeks gestation. The potential effects of that particular teratogen will be on the neurological, heart, upper limbs, lower limbs, and ear. The eye might be okay. Probably the palate and teeth will be okay, and external genitalia would be okay. Now, the different colors that you see here, like say we were looking at week 16, way over here. Someone gets exposed to a teratogen at week 16, you can see that as that line intersects for neurological development, it's still in the red as opposed to orange. That we'll just call it red and orange. We won't have an argument about what color you actually see. But so it comes into the red, and the red signifies major abnormalities. So we would, if there was a teratogenic effect in week 16, we'd say there's potential major abnormalities in neurology. The heart's okay, upper limbs, lower limbs, potential functional and minor abnormalities, the orange, functional and minor abnormalities in the ear and the eye, but the palate and teeth are okay. Well, the palate's okay, sorry. The teeth might end up with some functional and minor abnormalities, and the external genitalia might end up with some minor stuff there. So in the quiz, we're going to be, I give you a week and just kind of draw that line down that chart and describe potentially what you might see. So that's going to be the answer to that quiz. So let's go back to we're going to go right into critical periods and teratogens. What this chart really reveals for the first time in this course, but certainly not the last, is the idea of critical periods. That during our life, certain things are supposed to happen. Otherwise, there would be a missed opportunity on that. And there's lots of theories about how that applies outside in utero. It's pretty clear in utero that if we don't have that period of time for the ears to develop without interruption, if there's an interruption in there, there's going to be an abnormality in your ear structure or in your hearing. That's going to happen. It's almost, there's a high likelihood for that. Later on, we start to fudge things, like when we start looking for critical periods of emotional development, critical periods of developing intimacy, critical periods for language development. We have those periods of time when those things are kind of supposed to be happening that would result in the best outcomes if they happen during that period of time, but they're not as strict or sentencing as much as the early development, because this is almost all biological. But let's say early in life somebody struggled with attachment because they had a lack of a goodness of fit. So mom and kid or dad and kid never really kind of connected. Maybe they've lost that opportunity for that early childhood attachment experience. But that doesn't preclude them from later in life going through some personal growth and reflection and work, or maybe even therapy, to develop the capacities that they would have normally developed then and be able to have happy and successful attachment relationships as an adult. There's no reason why that can't happen, because we don't really know how definitive those lost opportunities are. And there's even some contention that there's certain abilities, like learning musical instruments or learning languages or whatever, that may or may not, they often are experienced as having critical periods, but they may in fact not be so locked into a particular time in our life. So that's kind of like the whole idea of critical periods. Now, teratogens, which in this case are anything that can impact in utero, are the diversity of poor experiences that can happen while a woman is pregnant. So I have a list here: alcohol, tobacco, prescription drugs, illicit drugs, pollutants, STDs, HIV, German measles. I mean, anything that happens to mom affects nutrition, like that. We know that a woman who's eating, the nutrition is going to go to them first, and then the baby gets the leftovers. So anybody who has been caught up in a dieting regime in order to minimize their personal weight gain because of being pregnant, that individual is actually putting their child at risk, because their body's going to take care of themselves before it takes care of that baby. In some very, very real ways, a baby is an invading being inside the woman, that without the placenta, the body would destroy it. The placenta provides a protection from the natural white blood cells and other ways in which we destroy invading organisms. And so it's really a foreign body, and the body's going to take care of itself first, just the way our biology works. And so we're mindful of that. In any tragedy, stress, going through a divorce, financial troubles. Right now, the period of time with the pandemic going on, it's very important for individuals who are bearing children to be very careful about their nutrition, about their stress level and stuff. And some of this is, pretty big environmental stuff. And so those can have impacts on those particular areas of development in utero. So back to the course book here, we end up in this a story of this individual right here. It's fetal alcohol syndrome. So take a look at that. Other risk factors: mothers over 35, teenage pregnancies, gestational diabetes, high blood pressure, all of these things. And then we go into prenatal assessments to determine if there's anything going on genetically. And then we look at childbirth and the different kinds of alternative birthing methods that are there. And we'll read more about those at the website, The Bump. And fathers and birthing, the importance of fathers, often not emphasized enough in our culture. And here's a picture from an article in the Daily Mail about a water birth at home, cultures and childbirth. And that's going to be introducing that special assignment that we have. And we go into the assessment area here. We have 2 discussions and a quiz. Our first discussion is for you to reflect on your own personality traits and consider your biological parents and whether you've kind of inherited anything from them. You have a similar sense of humor, or you're a detail-oriented person like your mom, or just those kinds of things. And kind of what I'd like to see is for you to identify something that's similar or maybe opposite from, but talk about both sides. Talk about why it's like you may have inherited parts of that genetically from your parents and describe that, but then also describe how your particular manifestation has been impacted by your environment that makes it maybe a little different from your parents. Because it's always may not be exactly the same all the time, but it might have different qualities based on your genetics, on your environment. So in your post, talk about both the nature and nurture component about the trait, but it is a trait that you see comes from your parents, or it's duplicated from your parents. So that's discussion number 1, or A. Discussion number B is looking at the pros and cons of home childbirth. This is a debate I usually have in my face-to-face classes. So let's see if we can talk about a debate. There's no right answer. People have the right to make their choices. People have strong opinions. I have strong opinions about it. But of course, we express support for one another in their particular viewpoints. This is really kind of a discussion of the ethics, personal ethics and decision-making regarding home childbirth. And finally, in quiz number 2, I'm having you use that chart. Please use the chart. Do not look things up. Do not go to any other place. Everything you need to answer this question is in that chart of in utero development where we drew the lines. Just make sure you use that chart to answer the question that I pose here in question 2. A friend approaches you and tells you while they were at a party she slipped a drug was slipped into her drink. She's not sure what it is, but she's worried about the potential impacts of the person and unborn child. She's in the 9th week of pregnancy, so you need to look up the 9th week, okay? And then you report to me in this quiz. You draw that line and you describe major abnormalities or minor and functional abnormalities associated with week 9. And so that's all I'm looking for you to use the chart to do that. The second and third questions have to do with cephalocaudal development and proximal development. Cephalocaudal meaning head to tail, proximal distal, midline, working out. Give me some examples of that and demonstrate your understanding of those concepts by giving me the definition and an example. An example is specific. Whenever I ask for an example, I don't want a version of the definition. I want my nephew, blah, blah, blah. Or when I was a kid, blah, blah, blah. Those are examples. I don't want, Otherwise, just a repetition of the definition. If it's not an example, there's going to be some points taken off for that. So that distinction between the definition and the example should be very, very stark. Should be very, very different. You may even use or fake the person's name, or I knew a person who, and you give the specific example. We have all experienced these things. So all of us can talk about these things, and we can see them in our own development. We can see them in others' development. So really important to take that critical thinking step to not only define, anybody can define, you can look it up and copy it out in a book, but to be able to then apply it to a real life situation in you, that is the learning. This is vital. So you can provide an example for it, and I know you understand it. And that's my goal. So that is week 2. I hope you're as excited as I am. I'll see you in the discussion boards. I hope you continue to have a good week, and please reach out if there's any questions, concerns, using email or the discussion board that are on Brightspace for that purpose. And I'll see you later.